Hello, this is the regular meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission, Thursday, April 25th, 2013. And roll call, please.
Commissioner Doe?
Present.
Commissioner Munir?
Here.
Commissioner Parker?
Here.
Commissioner Reinhardt?
Here.
The record show Commissioner Cunningham is absent.
It's now time for the adoption of the agenda. Any corrections?
No changes.
No changes?
I make a motion to adopt the agenda.
Second the motion?
All in favor?
Aye.
And we are open for oral communication. Anyone wants to speak and come up? Okay. I close the oral communications, and I see no written communications. Okay, we're on to item F, items initiated by staff.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. What you have before you is some material related to the draft Plan Bay Area, which is the plan prepared by Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG, and MTC. It's the proposed sustainable community strategy and regional transportation plan for the ABAG region, the 9-county Bay Area region. An environmental impact report has also been prepared for this particular draft plan. Really tonight is just to give the Commission some background on the plan, and provide you the opportunity to provide any comments as you see fit to the City Council. So that's really the purpose. So I'll kind of walk through very briefly highlight some of the purpose of the plan, and it's been a fairly extensive planning effort. And if anybody had the opportunity to look on the website, you can see there's extensive materials and documents and much more than can be kind of encapsulated in any presentation I can do tonight. But I want to just hit on the highlights. The draft plan represents a 25-year regional land use and transportation strategy intended to achieve state-mandated goals as set forth in SB 375. It requires each metropolitan region, such as ABAG for the Bay Area, to develop a sustainable community strategy, or SCS, which has three major components. It's supposed to establish a projected land use and transportation pattern to achieve regional emission reduction targets that were set forth by the state for each region. For the Bay Area region, the target is a 15% per capita reduction by 2035. So that was our regional target. And again, this only relates to light trucks and auto emissions. We're not talking about larger greenhouse gases associated with, energy use or anything else. The whole point of the SCS is to reduce vehicle related emissions. So that's, I think, an important consideration. Another major goal or objective was to identify areas within the region sufficient to house the projected population, including all economic segments. Like we do the housing element, you have very low income, moderate income, above moderate. So again, the housing supply has to meet all those housing category needs over the life of the plan. And again, the purpose is to minimize or eliminate in-commuting. People who have to come from San Joaquin Valley to work in the Bay Area is kind of the commute pattern they're really trying to discourage or eliminate by providing adequate housing to house the region's workforce. And then lastly is to identify a transportation network to serve the transportation needs of the region. And then the SCS process, or Sustainable Community Strategy, also tends to start to align land use and transportation investments. And that's where we get into the Regional Transportation Plan, or RTP, because that sets forth the investments and some of the expenditures for transportation. And the goal is for those transportation investments to support the preferred land use pattern that sets forth in the SCS. If you want to, for example, encourage infill development, you're not going to spend your transportation dollars building freeway extensions that are going to get people from the Central Valley to the Bay Area more quickly or easily, because that really isn't helping to encourage infill within the Bay Area, for example. So that's the kind of, we talk about a linkage between transportation expenditure and land use. That's kind of the thing they're talking about. They want to send transportation dollars to help stimulate and accommodate infill development. In the other third component, so you have the land use pattern, you have the transportation, you also have then the housing requirements, or the RHNA, regional housing needs allocation. It also has to be consistent with the SCS strategy. And we've already seen that with the first go-round for the next housing element. The city's received our housing allocation, which is consistent with the longer-term strategy. So again, this is a process that's been going on since 2011. ABAG's been primarily spearheading it. There's been extensive outreach through local communities, residences, businesses, environmental groups, and other stakeholders. Cities had the opportunity to participate and comment on certain iterations of the planning process, and I'll get into that in a little bit. I just want to kind of give you I've kind of already done it, but the overall strategy is to promote, of the draft Plan Bay Area, is to promote compact mixed-use development, combines residential and commercial uses, and located close to public transit, schools, jobs, shopping, parks, recreation, and other amenities. So, that's really the goal, is to have more complete communities with good access to transit that are provide a lot higher walkability, so people can really achieve their daily needs without having to get in a car. Auto being kind of a mode of choice, not necessity. The idea is setting up communities where people don't need to have a car to get around to meet their basic necessities. Much of the regional growth is projected to occur within the existing urban centers of Oakland, San Jose, and San Francisco. And I think some of the background information reflects that. Targeted growth is also anticipated to occur within, and I hate to keep using all these acronyms and whatnot, but areas known as priority development areas, or PDAs. You may have heard that phrase in other sort of conversations or contexts, but PDAs are locations that have been identified by local jurisdictions that have been identified as being opportunities to support additional housing and jobs growth. Typically, PDAs are in areas that are either located in proximity to transit centers, such as around BART stations or SMART stations up in Sonoma and Marin, or VTA stations, or along corridors with very robust transit and room and opportunities for additional housing to be constructed. So those are kind of, you find it in corridors and in these nodes around transportation areas. Also, many downtowns, larger downtown areas have PDAs. Redwood City, for example, would be an example in San Mateo County. There's PDA, and it can accommodate a fairly robust additional growth for both housing and jobs, primarily housing. And I think the approach of emphasizing infill as the primary means of meeting the region's projected growth should, and I think is intended to, reduce the amount of greenfield areas or raw land or natural land that has to be consumed to meet regional growth needs. And I think this was kind of a telling statistic. They say that the PDAs, which are all fairly urbanized areas or infill areas that are ripe for infill, additional development, they represent about 3% of the land area within the Bay Area, but they're projected to accommodate 77% of the region's new required housing and to accommodate about 63% of the employment. So obviously there's a lot of efficiency there of not converting raw land or natural land to accommodate kind of a sprawling growth pattern. So the idea is really infilling, intensifying development in areas that are intended for that purpose. There's also a pair, kind of a sort of a yin and the yang. You have the yin of the planned development areas and the growth, and there's also a offset or tempered by the identification of areas called priority conservation areas. And again, those are areas that there's a regional emphasis on conserving those properties. These are typically properties that are considered at risk of development, but that are seen as having habitat value, and value as either natural areas or agriculture. So you pair sort of the PDA, where you're trying to intensify the development and concentrate the development within the priority development areas, with these PCAs, or priority conservation areas, which the regional program and strategy is to preserve those properties in open space or agriculture in perpetuity. So you have these two kind of parts of the program that work together. You're trying to avoid this kind of sprawling pattern of new development sprawling into the suburbs, into important open space areas, or consuming agricultural lands with new development when you have these opportunities that can be infilled. So that's really the strategy that this whole plan is intended to achieve. And I'll throw out some numbers at you. They're not terribly useful, but in terms of in the abstract, but I'll throw them out there anyway. By 2040, Bay Area, so this is the whole 9-county region, is projected to add a little over 2 million people, which is about a 30% increase from 2010. So we're adding 2.1 million people. Expect to add about a little over a million jobs in that same time period. And then the number of households is expected to increase by 700,000 in that same period, which is about a 27% increase. So those are the three factors that are in play. It's kind of interesting. They do a fair amount of demographic work or modeling and forecasting to develop these projections. And I think some of the demographic trends that I think are noteworthy and you want to think about just in your role here as commissioner, and you think of what's going to happen in the future. So I think one of the key projections relates to job growth, and that they're estimating that 75% of the new jobs forecast in the region are going to occur in the fields of professional services, health, education, leisure, and hospitality. And so you have all these knowledge-based jobs. And it would be they expect that's going to carry the region's growth into the future. And there's a very definitive preference that those kind of industries historically like to be located in urban areas close to each other. You know, you have that whole synergy of these knowledge-based companies, social media, computers, you name it, and that's a pattern that you see. So you have the businesses that you anticipate growth in, again, feed into that growth pattern. They like to be located in urban areas where there's a lot of activity. They're not industries and jobs that are land-based in nature. They don't need cheap land. They don't need a lot of real estate. So the idea they're going to have an inherent preference, despite whatever the kind of the policies is, they're going to want to locate in these kind of urban cores and areas. They're not going to want to sort of sprawl out into the suburbs. That's not the nature of the business. And then the other elements that they're talking about are the service kind of jobs, health, education. Well, those jobs are going to follow population. Again, you're not going to have service jobs. They're going to be located in proximity to the populations they serve or the businesses they serve. So again, all these factors tend to lead to a promotion of this kind of infill-oriented kind of development. So you have demographic trends that are supporting, the idea of this concentrated, clustered future development. In terms of population perspective, the region's forecast to grow more ethnically diverse and older. The population of seniors is expected to increase substantially. Again, these kind of demographic changes also affect the housing market. Seniors whose mobility might be compromised by having, in terms of their ability to drive, the tendency for smaller kind of housing units and in proximity to amenities and transit, so they can retain their mobility without needing a car. So that will tend to do that. And some of the demographic changes too, in terms of diversity. Again, you have lifestyles that are a little people who are used to a different lifestyle than the kind of traditional single-family residence on a detached lot. And so with those kind of demographic changes, I think it would support the idea that more clustered, dense housing in corridors, urban areas would be, again, more desirable in the future than if you look back at maybe the growth patterns over the last 50 years. So I think those are kind of interesting when you think of how a region might grow and factors that go well beyond what any of us control in terms of planning decisions we make or planning commissions or city councils make, that you have these regional and national kind of demographic kind of considerations and market considerations that really do have a huge play in how the region overall kind of grows and is shaped. So again, the plan itself included a number of targets that were intended to be achieved by whatever sort of plan scenarios were developed, and I've just listed them here. Again, we had climate protection, about reducing the per capita CO2 emissions by 15% to house the region's projected growth. And those are the two sort of mandatory by law the plan is required to meet. Then there were a number of voluntary targets that were established, set forth on pages 3 and 4 of the staff report, related to health and safe communities, sort of reducing exposure to pollutants, the preservation of ag lands, increasing the gross regional product or economic vitality, increasing daily activity in terms of active transportation. Then a series of objectives related to transportation effectiveness, or shifting transportation methods from single-family auto to other modes, reducing vehicle miles traveled on a per capita basis. Then they have some that are related primarily to the transportation plan related to increasing the quality of the roadways in terms of their maintenance standards, and make sure you're maintaining your transit assets, you're maintaining your transit within its safe and useful lifetime. Then they have some other criteria or goals related to reducing injuries and fatalities from collisions, and a number of social equity-based objectives as well related to ensuring that communities of disadvantaged, whether it be minority or economically disadvantaged communities, aren't either disproportionately affected by pollution, for example, or displaced by this kind of infill growth, the idea that you don't want to push out classes of people to accommodate this regional growth. Some objectives related to that. Let's kind of dial it back to the local. Again, so you have this plan that's intended to cover the 9 counties, which it does, but it also does then sort of extrapolate it down or break it down into local jurisdictions. So, there's a regional projection. There are also projections that are sort of trickle down to San Mateo County and Brisbane specifically. And again, those are kind of outlined on page 5 here. As I indicated here, the number of units, and he's going to cut to the chase. The plan, the draft plan Bay Area projects residential housing growth of 250 units over the 30-year life of this plan, which if you consider, again, for context, that one housing element you did a couple of years ago required 401 units for 6 years. So now the projection is 250 for the next 30 years. So I think there's been probably a very valid and appropriate adjustment downward as to some of the expectation for an area like Brisbane to accommodate growth for a variety of reasons. And employment, again, it's a very limited employment growth. I do want to kind of talk a little bit about the Baylands, because when we talk about these kind of numbers, everything is divided up in terms of growth, whether it be housing or a population or jobs within PDAs and outside of PDAs, again with the emphasis on activity occurring within the PDAs. For those of you who aren't aware, the Baylands is a designated PDA as part of the adjacent properties in San Francisco to the north of us. And certain earlier iterations of the plans that ABAG had originally proposed did propose significant both housing and or jobs growth on the Baylands within that PDA. The city's point, when we were able to have the opportunity to feed into that process and comment, was that given where we are in our planning process with the Baylands, it'd be premature for MTC or ABAG to presume any particular land use development strategy would be approved. So we felt it was premature for them to say, well, yeah, you'll approve, there'll be 2,000 units there when the city hasn't approved any housing and may never approve any housing there. So this plan really almost puts the Baylands sort of on hold. It doesn't project any housing within the Baylands. It projects very, very limited employment growth in the Baylands, much less than any of the alternatives that are under consideration. The city's expectation is that this Bay Area plan has to be updated in about every 4 years. So in 4 years, when they're needing to update this plan, all the numbers for the Baylands will be revisited with the intent that they reflect the results of the city's planning process, which, knock on wood, will be completed in 4 years.
Yeah.
Don't smirk over there at that end of the table. Be optimistic here that yes, in 4 years there will be a plan, and then this regional plan would reflect what the city's approved, as opposed to being inside out, where the region says, oh yeah, this would be good for Brisbane and the Baylands to have X many units, and and to their credit, ABAG did understand sort of the problem with their approach, and they did reflect their numbers, revise their numbers accordingly to reflect the city's concerns. So I do want to acknowledge that they did cooperate in leaving the Baylands sort of out of the equation at this point in time, which we feel is appropriate. Again, the RTP, there's a whole number of exhibits to your report that speak to the number of dollars that are kind of allocated or expect to be allocated for transportation funding in the region. You're talking about nearly $290 billion over the life of the plan. But I think it's important to realize that 80% of those funds are pretty much already locked into, they're dedicated to certain purposes already. So it leaves about 20% of that pie to be discretionary monies, which totals about $57 billion of discretionary funding over the life of the plan. And again, there's an effort and a balance to be struck about maintaining kind of the current system, which is obviously a high priority, but still providing some incentives if you want to promote a certain development pattern that requires more robust transit or transportation improvements. Those dollars have to come somewhere. So the program, as they do envision it, would favor some of those kind of areas, development and PDAs, improvements that would support PDA development for some of the discretionary dollars that are out there. And there's, I think, a pretty good pie chart that shows kind of the funding sort of pie. And let's see where that is, if I can find it quickly. Page 45 of your staff report, if you want to look at it later. And I think the big program that you may have heard of is called the OBAG, or One Bay Area Grant Program. Represents about $14 billion over the life of the program. And that's the one that is really very much oriented toward PDA supportive investments. I think that's an important consideration. That's been kind of there's a tension within the county and within the region, because if you're in an area that doesn't happen to it's not served by transit, it may not be a good place to really have a lot of intense growth over the time. Some of those jurisdictions, rightly so, they may feel that they're being sort of shorted, that they're getting deprived of transportation dollars that are very needed to maintain their own facilities. And that is kind of an ongoing source of tension, I think, within this plan, within the region. But on the other hand, if you expect jurisdictions to accommodate that growth and they're willing to take on that growth, it would be natural that you'd want to incentivize that by help paying for some of those improvements, because that again is a regional benefit theoretically. So I mean, it is a tension that's that's an ongoing, and I don't think it's ever going to be resolved. I think these programs are all sort of new, and they may be adjusted over time depending on how they seem to be working or not working. So I think this whole plan, I think you have to look at as kind of a work in progress. It is the first time the region's done something like this, and inevitably there may be adjustments to it over time. Okay, so the RTP, touched about that. Some of the projects that are kind of called out specifically in San Mateo County in the RTP as being of regional benefit or regional importance from a transportation and transit standpoint include the Caltrain electrification is one, El Camino BRT, or Bus Rapid Transit, Highway 101 interchange improvements, and Redwood City Ferry being kind of projects within San Mateo County that are seen to be regionally important.
Do you remember what page that was on?
It's on page 15.
Page 15, okay, just.
Yeah, I think so. And also, I summarize them on page 6 of the staff report,
Okay,
too.
page 6.
The other thing I didn't highlight in this particular section, but they're also included are things like the Geneva extension. So projects that are at the county line, some of those improvements, the interchange, Candlestick Interchange, Geneva, are also designated or recognized as regionally important transportation improvements too. So I did want to highlight that. I don't think I had picked it up earlier. So you have the plan, you have the RTP, you have the last component, I would say, is the draft environmental impact report for this plan. And again, maybe it has some value, when you do have the time to look at it in more detail. If we consider the Baylands EIR to be programmatic in nature, this is also a programmatic EIR. I mean, obviously the activities are even less well-defined, and the geographic area is much, much larger than the Baylands. But I think if you look at this EIR, you look at certain elements of what a programmatic EIR does, how it analyzes things. So it might be just kind of useful for you to review in that sort of more of a global level to understand what you might be seeing in the forthcoming Baylands EIR. Because again, the programmatic EIR, it does not include a project-specific analysis of any individual project component. I talked about the Redwood City Ferry being something they might want to fund, or Caltrain electrification. The programmatic EIR for this plan does not analyze any one of those individual projects. It's not project specific. It has a list of projects. It sort of looks cumulatively at what the impacts are of undertaking those projects, but it does not claim to they analyze the physical effects of each project that might be considered under that. So I think that's a big difference. When you look at an EIR like this, it's going to analyze all these projects that make up the program. That's not the case at all. It kind of looks at the cumulative aspect, not the individual components per se. And I did attach the executive summary. The EIR was pretty exhaustive. What did it include? Topics of transportation, air quality, land use, climate change, noise, biological resources, visual resources, historic resources, public utilities and facilities, hazards, and public services. And those all had impacts that were determined to be unavoidable and significant. Other impacts associated with energy, geology, and seismicity and water resources were either considered less than significant or mitigated to a less than significant level. Again, when you review an EIR like this too, there are a number of topics. The EIR determines the conclusion is significant and unavoidable. And I think if you look through the executive summary, you'll find that there are a lot of suggested mitigation measures, maybe in any given topic. Let's just pick air quality for construction. There are a lot of protocols and procedures you would require for dust control, for hours of operation, for the kind of equipment you use. Since this project isn't is not actually constructing any of these projects, right? It's not actually, ABAG isn't constructing any given interchange or a transit stop or anything, or a development project. It would be up to the local jurisdictions to actually impose mitigation measures. And since ABAG can't impose those mitigation measures or guarantee that they will be imposed by the local jurisdictions will be the lead for individual projects, even though they can identify mitigation measures which might mitigate the impacts, if they can't guarantee they're going to be implemented, legally you cannot determine that impact is mitigated. Because to have a mitigable impact, you need to be in control and be in a position where you can actually impose that by law. And so they're not in a position by law to impose many of the recommended mitigation measures in here. And I think that was kind of an unusual thing I wanted to point out for the commissions, kind of just for your information. And again, backing parallels to what the Baylands, we're in a different position. We will have less of that, but there may be conditions where certain activities will have to be undertaken by Caltrans, or for example, if the city can't guarantee, and the city's not in a position of telling Caltrans how to do their business or what to approve, so there may be mitigation measures that could meet an impact, but the city may not be able to be in a position of imposing them, right? Because some other lead agency would actually have to impose those mitigation measures. So I think it's just a little quirk of CEQA that, again, this is actually kind of a good educational thing for you.
Somehow I got a little lost there. I don't know if
it's kind of obtuse.
I must have spaced out.
Got lost in my, reverie of my talk here. I think the point is that when you have, and I think it's very clear that if you have a project that is going to require a new freeway interchange, for example, for a local jurisdiction, we might say, well, to mitigate the impact on this functioning of this area, the off-ramp should have 2 through lanes and 1 left turn lane and a right turn lane at this interchange, the off-ramp. That would be and if you did that and you signalized it, then the traffic flow would be adequate. You'd mitigate the traffic impact. This is just a hypothetical.
Right.
Well, the city could identify that as part of an EIR for a project. Say we have a Baylands type project where you're approving a land use that this interchange is required for. So you've identified this as an improvement that's going to be made, and you require these certain design features to mitigate the traffic impact. The city is not responsible for building the interchange. The interchange would be within a Caltrans right-of-way. Do you understand that? That the city doesn't build highways that are state highways. The Caltrans has to actually build that.
Right.
The city cannot, by law, tell Caltrans, we can't impose our mitigation measures on a state agency. We could say, yeah, we think this is the right design and we think this is what you should do, but we cannot legally make them, and we cannot impose our recommended mitigation measures for Caltrans to actually do. So because of that, if you're in a position where somebody else is responsible for implementing the mitigation measure and you're not in a position of enforcing it, you may have identified mitigation measures that would reduce an impact to a less than significant level, but your EIR will typically conclude that impact is unavoidable and significant because you don't control the implementation. You can't control that Caltrans is going to guarantee that. You say you do your best, you're going to work with Caltrans to make sure these improvements are made, but that's really as far as the city can go in terms of assuring or ensuring that improvement is made. So
but the question will be that in that particular case, if Caltrans cannot do that, then how can the project proceed? Because it will have a significant impact.
Well, the city's EIR, the local jurisdiction EIR, will have already presumed that it has a significant unavoidable impact because we couldn't guarantee that.
But the thing is, according to the discussion here, Caltrans, we have no jurisdiction over Caltrans, what they can do, but we do have the jurisdiction over the developer, what he can do. So if we put a condition that in order to mitigate the traffic impact, these things to be implemented is for example, Geneva overpass has to be built. before we even consider this. So in that particular case, if we don't have the jurisdiction and we met the recommendation, then how the developer is going to proceed with the project, because he cannot ignore our recommendation, but at the same time he has no way to tell Caltrans to build it. So that means the project is dead.
If an improvement like that, I think we're talking about sort of different scale kind of issues. If I think the city would want to be in a position of ensuring that the required public improvements are in place before you allow certain phasing and timing, and then that would be a condition. Any improvement like that, though, you're right, it's going to take typically a kind of a combined funding effort, because the developer, because typically, again, like any sort of regional improvement, you build a Geneva interchange, you build an interchange at Candlestick, you build Geneva Avenue extension, is not just the development that will use that, correct? Other people who are traveling the area will use that, so you always have a sort of a other public component, and that's pretty much aside from the mitigation. Sort of two separate things. One is funding the improvement in terms of how that is structured. The other is identifying it as a requirement of the project and mitigation. But I think fundamentally you have the same issue. If we can't guarantee it's going to be done at this point in time, you'd have to identify that as somewhat an unavoidable impact.
But that really puts a monkey wrench on the Baylands, because a lot of the traffic impact will be mitigated with the Geneva extension. Mm-hmm. And if that's not in the cards with the Caltrans or state, then this project will not go very far. Oh
yeah, but it is in the cards. I mean, I wouldn't say that these improvements are, I don't want to get too far into taking the hypothetical and spinning it into the Baylands, because I think there'll be a pretty robust discussion of the transportation.
Yeah, I'm just bringing for the rest of the commission.
Oh yeah, no, I appreciate that.
To be aware of that as to what we're going to face here, because that will be the determining factor, one of the determining factor for that particular project.
Absolutely.
And I think we should be prepared, because that's going to be politically really, really sensitive. And I'm sure the cities and a city will also get the pressures from all sides. And as a planning commission here, we have to be very, very, upfront as to what we're looking for, and also we need to have some kind of a communication with the city council also in that respect as to how we're going to deal with this whole issue. So this is really good in that respect, that it does give a little bit idea to the commission as to what's going to happen, how it will be dealt with.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's there is a bit of context that certain elements of this you'll be facing this in a much more sort of focused,
detailed manner,
kind of scale. But I mean, some of the ideas in terms of you're not looking at every, it's programmatic. It's not every particular project. Same thing, the EIR for the Baylands won't look at every building. You won't be looking at the environmental impacts of building a particular building, because the program doesn't allow for any given building. It's a building program, for example. So I mean, that idea of applicability, I think, is, again, if you look through it, have a chance to look through sections that are of interest to you through that kind of lens, it might be educational for you.
But sometimes you may have a chance to subdivide the area also for a particular use within the development. So, for example, for Baylands, if you're talking about the solar energy part of that whole thing in a separate area, windmill and all that, that could be a whole separate section of the EIR, or can be an independent EIR. So it can be done that way also.
Yeah, I mean, once you have something approved, then how it actually, phasing and whatnot is something that will follow its own course.
I just had a question generally, conceptually. So when you have a significant and unavoidable mitigating factor that directly impacts the local area, yet the local area has no real ability to charge that, I guess, that deciding body, then how does the balance go in terms of practical outcome?
Well, the city council ultimately, if they're going to approve a project that has unavoidable significant impacts, they're going to have to make what are called findings, overriding findings and consideration of why approving the project despite these unavoidable adverse impacts is, in the city's best interest. They'll have to elaborate and list a set of findings on why they're doing that. Something like these kind of, if you have a regional, and really the only reason the impact is unavoidable is because the city, it's going to be some other agency is obligated to actually enforce it. That can be explained that, you're going to work with these people, you're going to make sure this gets done, blah, blah, blah. It's just legally, it's still going to result in an unavoidable finding, or a conclusion of significant unavoidable impact. But the finding would articulate, the idea that if these other things are done, and that'd be part of the justification that you're going to work with these agencies that have this responsibility to ensure that you do your best to ensure that they do what's required by CEQA to mitigate the impact. You just can't say that, that's mitigated to a less than significant level.
So historically, how much weight does that type of report carry?
Well, I think if you look at these agencies who have sort of regulatory authority, Caltrans wants to make sure their freeways function, that their interchanges function, so they're not going to want to necessarily under-design. They're going to want to make sure that their traffic flow isn't impeded either. So if there are certain improvements that are required that serve the development and serve the larger flow of the freeway and the interchange functioning, they're normally going to want to impose those kind of conditions as well. So, it's normally we're all the same goal. It's very unlikely where the public purpose of a mitigation measure is somehow at odds with some other regulatory agency. It's normally all in the same way. It's more a matter of timing and authority. Is that we can't, there's no definitive way the city engineer, the planning director, or the mayor, or anybody can say, is this going to be done? Well, we believe so, but we can't guarantee it given, until you have that agreement. And a lot of these other regulatory agencies want to see the final approval before they jump into their sort of approval process.
So in this document, I guess, speaking to that is an executive summary. Was this more of a strategic move or just to voice their ideals as far as the mitigation?
I think they would hope that, and a lot of the local jurisdictions might rely on this. If I had a project that, if we had a regional project, I would expect we would want to look back to these mitigation measures, see which ones are applicable to a transportation improvement, for example, and you'd want to impose those that have been identified by somebody else as being valid mitigation. So that would be not uncommon, is to, in a sense, you're not tearing off because you're not adopting their entire document, but you're basically taking work that's been done, that's been certified, and saying, okay, these mitigation measures have been quantitatively, validated. Okay, we're going to impose them on our project, as opposed to remaking the wheel of developing your own. So that way, it's easier in a sense where this EIR creates maybe a hierarchy for local jurisdictions to then identify. They don't have to go out to the cost and the expense of developing these independent mitigation measures. They can actually, they've been identified for them, and actually makes it easier to impose them in a sense.
That's what it is.
Somebody else has created them for you.
Good. Yeah, it's good practice. It's already done. It's sound.
And it's been, once it's certified, that has a certain weight that is valuable.
I have a question. I was reading through this and I had a vision of how this was put together, and I wanted to see if that was indeed correct. So what they did is they went to all the different cities and all the different counties, and they asked what were the proposed developments and the plans that were upcoming, that were in this general area, and the funds that were set aside, I imagine, with the redevelopment agencies. And And then I looked at the infrastructure and how much it was going to need to be maintained and repaired. Some of the infrastructure is very old at this point as far as transportation is concerned. And that's how they came up with this. I was just wondering, it seemed like maybe, I don't know if this is just a question of curiosity, but
Yeah,
that seems to me this kind of the bones of this situation.
I think there are a couple different pieces to it. From the land use and kind of the PDA side of it, I think it was very much a locally driven. You had to, as a local jurisdiction, you had to actually make an application to ABAG to have property within your jurisdiction identified as a PDA. And you had to indicate what its planning was and what kind of development was, you were anticipating. And they would actually then have to approve it as a PDA. And you have to, demonstrate you had transit, demonstrate however you're meeting the criteria of why this would be a good location for this kind of intensified development. And then once you're in a PDA, there's the incentive, obviously in certain jurisdictions, very good planning. It makes a lot of sense to try to concentrate your development around these kind of features and facilities. But there's also inherently you were gaining access to certain pools of funding, whether it be planning funding, whether it be transportation improvements, that if you were in a PDA, they gave you somewhat of a competitive leg up. So there was a sort of a carrot for a city to go ahead and commit property as a PDA. There's a funding carrot, and so that's sort of the planning side, and where these 110 PDAs were created. Those were all created locally by a local jurisdiction, voluntarily did.
So, well, maybe I missed something there then. How come our application, I guess, for the PDA like in the Baylands didn't include the goal of not including housing, excluding housing? Because a lot of the letters in this document had to make the point to them that housing shouldn't be included in the PDA. So, wouldn't that be part of the application summary or description?
Yeah, I think it's all a matter of timing too, because one, we don't have an approved plan for the Baylands.
Sure.
So, we're going through a PDA process. There are a couple of considerations. One is, as part of a larger PDA, the San Francisco PDA that includes the Schleglock site and Executive Park, there is housing within that PDA. That there's going to be no doubt.
Sure. Whether
or not any of that housing might be in Brisbane or not is that's a story that hasn't been told yet. So you had that fact. The PDA, irrespective of what land use decisions Brisbane would make, would include jobs and housing in proximity to transit. That was the underlying sort of premise. And on that basis, it qualified as a PDA.
Right. But then there was the letter following.
Yeah, then the other part of it is, since you have a developer's proposal, which is still out there, that had housing, it would be not very legally appropriate for the city to say, predetermine what the outcome of that planning process would be when you have a pending application before the city, to somehow assume that and a certain outcome. Just like we told ABAG, they shouldn't assume a certain outcome of a planning process, that they should leave it open. It's very likely a property owner might make the same claim if the city were to say, well, this is going to be X on the Baylands, because the city council has not made the determination of what that final land use plan is. So the idea that it's in flux. You have you have a developer's proposal, you have other.
Oh, sure, that makes sense. But who then actually submitted the application? I guess from
the PDA.
Yes,
the city did.
The city did. Yeah. So then, okay. It just seems. I understand what you're saying. It just seems that they wouldn't. That would have been outlined earlier. That the outcome of the housing, shouldn't be used in the way that it seemed to have been. Yeah, the initial application.
I think we have a kind of a unique nuance. If you think of ABAG and putting this larger plan together, and they have 110 PDAs, and our nuance, I think, is fairly unique even among the PDAs, and so
Okay.
the fact that they might have misinterpreted, and I think that's, basically they misinterpreted information in terms of, okay.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
They
then.
took, again, I think their default is always think of the higher, more intensity around transit. So, I mean, they probably, if you said, there was going to be a range, they just took the highest end of the range and ran with that in terms of, okay, that's what it'll be, not understanding that the land use was still,
In flux.
undetermined.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And once they understood that, it was very easy for them. They made the simple adjustment for us.
Okay.
So I also had a question. There's total funding of $286 billion, of which there's going to be some set aside. Is that funding something that could be taken away, such as happened with the redevelopment agency? Or how is this set up so that...
Well, the whole transit piece of it is probably, and transportation piece is really kind of stepping into the city engineers' area of expertise. These are funds that some are going to be more, they come from local gas tax, some come from local gas tax, some come from federal sources, the Transportation Enhancement Act, T money, and so there's a whole series of different funding sources. Each one has kind of almost a different stream, right? So to the extent that any of those streams can ultimately be altered or terminated, I think everything is, this is a projected plan, right? This is money they're anticipating. If people were to significantly alter their driving habits for whatever reason, and you're expecting a certain number of dollars from gas tax, you may fall short just based on not generating, tax that you just were projecting.
Suddenly have electric instead of gas?
So, all these kind of things, and then what the federal government, trickles down in terms of transportation dollars by administration. These acts tend to have to get updated every so many years, and certain years the emphasis is on, you name it. It can be, they can be oriented more toward transit. They could be more oriented toward maintenance. So, there's always going to be a bit of flexibility and flex, and that's why they have to revisit these plans on they plan out for 30 years. They'll have to revisit it in 4 and see what the situation is then. So I think there's always some level of flex with or flexibility or uncertainty when you're projecting out 30 years worth of a revenue stream.
So this EIR is actually not, it's going to be an EIR that, as an EIR, will be open to a lot of modification, or not really? My understanding with the other EIRs is that once the plan is set up, then basically you can't really change or modify the plan to a significant degree.
Well, yeah, I think what you're going to have here is, the EIR will be certified, and the actionable item going to be taken by MTC board and ABAG will be the adoption of the plan, right? That's what's going to happen. They're going to get a plan adopted, and I think their goal is to get it adopted this summer sometime. So then they're going to have a legal obligation in 4 years, I believe it's 4 years, to update their plan. So the EIR will be certified. This plan is approved. The book is closed in terms of the environmental document for this particular plan. 4 years, they have to do a new plan. How much of this EIR can be used to support the plan 4 years from now? Everyone will have to decide in 4 years, right? How much changes, how much of this information is still valid, how much the plan has been changed. So, every plan will have to have its own environmental review. It's not that this EIR remains open for any, once it's certified, the book is sort of closed,
right.
And the plan is really what's the living document in a sense,
Right.
and will be modified over time.
Let me elaborate on one of the questions the chairperson brought up. Regarding the funding for the transportation, when it comes to the federal funding, it's brought through the Federal Highway Administration. And in California, it's managed by Caltrans. So that money cannot be touched. It's used for the for the transportation needs. However, they can shift the money between different type of projects. For example, they can put more money in transit, or they can put more money in the freeway projects. So they have that discretion, and there are other funding sources. The gas tax. Now that particular one is run by the state, and that can be shifted to another type of projects, not necessarily transportation. So that part is always iffy when you want to program as to how much money you're going to get in the transportation funds. That piece is not always there. And as far as the transit goes, it always changes every time the federal administration changes. What happens is when the Democrats come in or Republicans come in, they go after their own favorite state. So, for example, during the time when Democrats were from California, we got a lot of money for transit improvements in Los Angeles and BART and all of that. And when it's changed to another administration, and all of a sudden all the Washington metropolitan area, they got all the money. So it changes with every 4 years, and normally Democrats seems to prefer California and Florida, and the Republicans, they have the middle states like Atlanta and all those places. So as a result, Atlanta got a lot of money also in one of the Republican administrations. So that piece here is again very uncertain as to how the money will be, how much money will be there. May I have some more questions for the staff, or you have any more?
No?
I had a couple more questions.
Go ahead, then I will ask some
So
more questions.
I was wondering, in terms of the local considerations, how did the PCA for Brisbane factor in? I'm assuming the San Bruno Mountains would be considered PCA, or no?
Actually,
Was there any?
no, because it's almost ironic is one of the criteria for a PCA is property that's at risk to development pressure. San Bruno Mountain is protected. It's already protected. So in a way, if you were proactive and kind of took steps historically to preserve open spaces, you didn't necessarily get any credit from this. The PCA is really to relieve areas that are suffering, development pressure now and in the future, and the idea that there are lands that aren't now protected, but that it would be regionally important to protect.
Is that true for like historic areas as well, or is that not included in?
I think primarily what they've been looking at is wildlife
Habitats.
and habitats and agriculture. The idea that agricultural lands being converted to homes and commercial is another sort of policy objective, is to minimize or eliminate that to the extent possible. So those are
So like Ice House Hill could fall within that, but Roundhouse area not.
Yeah, and I don't think, again, you're talking about things that are regional in scale.
Yeah.
San Bruno Mountain is regional in scale. Ice House Hill, sort of a standalone or a remnant of a larger, wouldn't fall into that kind of PCA sort of qualitative aspect.
Okay.
And in terms of our communication and our involvement from the local level and going up, our last communique, or at least written communique, was April 18th, 2012. Since then, how have we been involved? Because that's about a year in between.
Well, the ABAG staff and MTC have been working on really preparing the plan. You had this draft, which was more of a set of diagrams and the policies and the objectives. So really, they've spent the last year probably fleshing it out. So it's not like there's been a lot of, they had their direction in terms of what their board adopted last year as really the plan, the bones of the plan, and they spent the last year really fleshing that out. So there hasn't been a real lot of involvement until they rolled it out fairly recently. Some work with the OBAG, the funding program, was probably the highest sort of level of activity, because they've actually gone through a funding cycle with that One Bay Area grant funds, and that whole idea about the funds being dedicated to priority development areas and all the kind of consternation that went with that did play out through the last funding cycle as well. But, again, it was ultimately the board's decision that, if you're going to try to promote this form of intensified development around transit, you need to put some carrot for those jurisdictions who are willing to step up and do that in terms of these transportation dollars. So, will that change next time? There was just a 70-30 split in the way the program's funded right now. Some people say that's too skewed heavily toward PDAs, and it's disenfranchising jurisdictions that don't have PDAs, and again, that'll be a political decision when the board looks at kind of because that's really a discretionary funding. It's all up to MTC how they choose to, make up the rules to allocate those funds. So, they could do that in 2 years. They could change the rules, or they could keep the rules in place.
No more questions for me.
Any more?
I just had one last one. In terms of the draft EIR, at the very end on F-160, where the issues to be resolved are provided, what happens after this is evaluated and presented to the council?
What page are you on?
F-160.
160 page.
F-160.
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting way. You don't normally see it in an EIR structured this way. This is kind of left hanging. And I think but they really, on these issues, they've hit on, especially these first 2 bullets, are probably issues that at this point the EIR process is not going to resolve. Frankly, I think the third one, we've already talked a little bit about the incentivizing of how people incentivize people to actually just implement the mitigation measures that have been identified. That third bullet might be a little easier. And there are also CEQA incentives if people agree to pre-existing mitigations that will help streamline their CEQA process. But I think these first 2 bullets are really policy issues that this EIR is not going to solve those, and they're going to probably make some policy direction when this plan is adopted on how they might want to address these. Like the second bullet in particular, incentives for implementation of land use policy. That's part of what the grant program is intended to do, trying to incentivize people. But, there may be, for all the people who said that there wasn't enough, that too much money was being diverted to PDAs, there's probably another group of people saying not enough money is going to the PDAs to really incentivize the kind of development that this plan anticipates. So again, there's a constant sort of pull and tension, and again, that's not going to be resolved in an EIR. It's just identifying it as a policy issue that the boards are going to have to grapple with in the future.
Yeah, that's interesting though that the guidelines. They included that because it's like it requires a discussion. So they found that part of the CEQA guidelines so they can include. I just find that interesting. It requires a discussion whether it's actually resolved or not.
So I guess it could somewhat be addressed in the statement of overriding considerations, somehow.
Yeah, although I'm not sure. I'm not sure that any of these 3 ultimately are environmental in nature. They get more to intergovernmental authority and the fact that ABAG has no land use authority or MTC has no land use authority, and you're recognizing land use patterns and assuming land use patterns, but fundamentally they can't require. Say somebody has a PDA and they were calling for this many dwelling units and this many, and well, by the time it got around to getting approved, the jurisdiction only approved half of what they told, ABAG they were going to do. ABAG has no recourse. They have no land use authority. So that gets to these kind of issues. And if they're not going to have a stick, what is the carrot to help push, jurisdictions to fully, implement this plan to the best of their abilities?
Yes, but it does raise framing concerns, which does in some way direct the conversation. Right?
Oh, absolutely. These are, absolutely. These are big picture questions that, that's why I think, ABAG's real push on this is a bottoms up. These jurisdictions have voluntarily, agreed to do these kind of actions, and they've put themselves in a facilitator role. And how can we facilitate this development that these jurisdictions already told us they want to do and they think is a good thing, and we're just trying to facilitate that. Very different if they found themselves in a position of trying to be a traffic cop and saying, well, gee, you told us you were going to do X, but you did X divided by, you did a third of X, or, that's not a position that is very politically tenable for them to be in at all.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Of course, what I see is a real issue here that I haven't read the section on rising sea levels, but we are simply on flatlands. Most of the building, the areas that they're targeting to increase high density housing is on flatlands. If the water tables, if the sea levels start rising, some of these areas might start looking like Detroit, just huge, empty areas. I really have no idea how that's going to be resolved, and I haven't looked at the EIR in that area. I don't know. Did anyone have a chance to look? And did you?
No.
What I think ABAG's point, and I only had a chance to skim over all the sections, but their point is that there are certain areas that are already sort of armored, and there's a certain amount of both infrastructure and investment and housing in certain areas. And in certain areas, the expectation would be that given the current level of development and the kind of infrastructure that there's going to be a continued sort of armoring and protection of those kind of resources and those investments. And their point is, if you're going to spend money to protect these investments, it actually makes sense. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but if you're going to protect that area, then you might as well intensify the development, because you're then actually getting more out of your investment of protection. You don't have to protect it any higher because you increased your density by 5-fold behind. If you're going to have to protect an area, you're going to protect the freeway, you're going to have to protect a rail line. It doesn't cost you any more to protect it if you're running 10 trains an hour or 1 train an hour or a train a day. If you're going to protect that investment, you might as well get the most utility out of it. And if you're going to protect the neighborhood or a community that's developed at 4 units to the acre, if you bump that up to 8 units to the acre, it's not going to increase the cost of your protection necessarily. So, but that's probably an oversimplification, but I think that's kind of how their minds work in some of these areas. And they identify certain areas that are certainly not suitable for what you call almost greenfield or new development. And most of these PDAs are not areas that are certainly not green fields in any stretch of the imagination. These are all infill sites that have some level of investment in them already. But it's a very good question, and they even talk about the need for a more regional, comprehensive climate change adaptation sort of program, working with BCDC to do that. And BCDC's already developed some sort of preliminary guidance, in particular in the Hayward. That's kind of was their sort of test area across in the East Bay with Hayward, and and sort of some of the shoreline parks down there, about some of their strategies that they're successful, and they think they're successful. They'd like to sort of expand them. And they have this whole range of areas that you retreat from, and you have areas that you harden because they're already, they have assets that are going to need to be protected. And then, but yeah, they do have areas that, they do talk about managed withdrawal, that, it's just not going to be cost effective to protect these areas over time, and you don't want to invest anymore, and you're talking about how you pull back from those areas. But, there's certainly, but they do recognize the fact that there are certain investments that there's going to be a regional and, need to protect those investments and that infrastructure.
Well, that certainly answered my question.
I don't think so. It's a lot, but certainly I think when you have time, you start perusing that section of the document, I think it'll be, I just didn't have quite enough time to absorb this and get it out in a form that's all that useful. So I do apologize for not being as prepared as I might like to be on an item of this kind of scope.
But the other side of the coin is they go ahead and develop in those areas already, like Redwood City, for example. They converted all those into housing right where that restaurant and protected area was, where I think it's called Redwood Shores development now.
Yeah, Redwood Shores.
Yeah. So the thing is, when the concern for the rising water and all that area is already ahead of these kind of restraints if they ever put on those. Mm-hmm. So I think the idea will be to come up with some kind of a mitigation measure to prevent the effect of the rising sun and rising sea, and that's
absolutely
what I think they will do. So, but that cost should be included here. I think that's why I was kind of wondering that in Protect Our Climate, they have only less than 1%. The discretionary fund is only less than 1%. And the thing is, those are the issues that, the protection of the environment right now is the biggest concern right now. And that will also, I guess, filter into green building initiative and all that. So how that money, how those programs can be, promoted. I thought they would put some more money in here, but it's less than 1% of the total. And also the next generation transit, I think they're still talking about it, and studies after the studies show that that is not feasible in California. Mass transit next generation transit it's a high-speed train and high-speed Caltrain corridor and all that. I think there are certain number of lobbyists or people, they are still continue to put this in the program, and even though studies after studies show that it's going to be cost prohibitive, but if you look at it, they still put a pretty good chunk of money, 9%, into that one. So that's surprising to me. And also I was looking at this table on page 129, and if you look at the some of the columns under the housing units increase, Brisbane is 13%, whereas Belmont is only 10%. So to me, that doesn't seem to make sense. I thought the Belmont is much bigger area. So I don't know whether these figures are correct or not.
Well, I'm sorry, which page?
This is page 129.
1.29.
129.
Yeah, 1.29.
So if you look at the Brisbane, it's talking about 13%, but Belmont is at 10%. So that doesn't seem to be consistent in my opinion. I think there's something wrong here. And also the percentage growth, Belmont is only 11%, we're talking about 15% in Belmont, in Brisbane. That's also again kind of, and Foster City is 8.5%, which I can see that they don't have much area to grow. But if you look at all of those very expensive areas, they've shown very little growth in those areas, like Atherton and this Portola Valley, the Hillsborough. If you look at it, is it purposely done that way or what? Because they have lots of land and they should be able to provide lot more housing. Then how come the MTC didn't stress those areas that they should be contributing towards the regional needs?
It's obviously a sort of a delicate sort of, because the same person who would, I don't know that the city strategically is in a really strong position to sort of point out, sort of the person in glass house throwing stones. I'm not sure that the city of Brisbane is really, because I'd hate to be in a position of explaining why around a Caltrain station and transit, we have our own good reasons for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And like an outsider might not really think our reasoning is all that valid either. So it gets a little sticky. I can tell you that for this first, the next RENA cycle, the next RENA numbers for this forthcoming, where we have our 82 units or whatever, Belmont actually ended up taking, there was a number of units that were sort of in dispute, I guess, or not in dispute, but certain jurisdictions were claiming hardship that they couldn't achieve, and Belmont ended up taking those extra units in this first cycle. I figure they'll get a break at the back end, or they'll get, their numbers will work out in the end, but I think what we all try to do collaboratively is try to work together, and the idea of saying to get our percentage down, we should strike 3 units off our count or 6 units off a count of 250.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's a lot of real regional goodwill gained by doing that, and that's my personal opinion.
I'm just raising these questions. I mean, there might be many reasons for doing that. Same thing with, if you look at the chart on F1.29 and F1.30, and
1.20?
I think behind that. If you look at Pacifica, the growth of the housing is only 5%, and yet they have the percentage growth of jobs will be 21%. So it's much higher jobs, but how come very little housing growth there? Shouldn't that be more like in line with the number of jobs created?
I think you also want to look at the balance, because currently they would be considered a housing rich. They probably have 3 times more households than they have jobs in the town already. So there's usually an idea people try to balance their employment and their housing internally. Yeah. So I think this is again one of those adjustments. If an area is jobs poor, you would actually want them to provide a few more jobs so they don't become sort of an out, especially somewhere that's sort of has really no decent transit like Pacifica. So that, anyone who lives there is going to have to commute by vehicle wherever they're going, over the hill, up into the city or what have you. So the idea is if you increase their jobs base, perhaps you can reduce again the amount of VMT by providing some more employment for those residents who are right now out migrating.
Yeah.
So.
And the whole reason for me asking this question is I'm just trying to see whether there was any kind of a any kind of a plan to distribute the housing units in such a way that it kind of balances the job growth on the other hand. But my concern was that 22% increase in the job, and the housing is not increased, only increased by 5%. Those 17% of the people, do they have to commute from Pacifica, or is there an existing housing to accommodate those people?
Well, as I stated, they already are about 3 to 1. There are 3 more,
But
3 times as many.
That's not here, though. I mean, is that chart is here to show that
Sure,
at present
sure.
there are 3
If you look at housing units Pacifica on page F29,
Yeah.
14,520 housing units in 2010, correct?
Yeah.
So if we go to how many jobs are in Pacifica in 2010, 5,920. So if you go to the next page, F130, right? So if you look at the current jobs in Pacifica is 6,000 jobs. They have 6,000 jobs and about 14,500 housing units. That would be considered a jobs poor. The ratio of jobs, so if you want to look at sort of the other, look at Brisbane. So we're at 1,930 housing units and 7,000 jobs. So, the idea is to try to improve the balance between jobs and housing. And it's never going to be a one-for-one kind of deal, but, I think in a situation like Pacifica or other places, I didn't really look at Belmont, 8,000 jobs. I mean, they're also a little jobs poor relative to housing. So it's quite possible they were adjusted, their housing numbers adjusted down or their jobs up, again, to try to create a bit more of a balance between housing and jobs internal to the jurisdiction.
Birmingham has a pretty heavy household growth, 36% almost, right? That's, I don't know whether they have enough room to accommodate that many.
Well, they do have that. If you look at that one transit town center, that takes, significant number of their population within a PDA, right? Most of that's occurring within a PDA. So that's an area.
That's probably the one, yeah.
Yeah, and that's one they've designated for that kind of growth. So, again, they were somewhat housing. They were pretty jobs intense compared to their housing. Yeah.
So those were my concerns with this report. Thank you. I can go on for a while, but I don't want to.
If anyone, I have a question. Would you like to ask some questions? Oh, you're just listening. Okay. Do we have any recommendations or questions for the City Council? Let me see if I have all my questions answered. I actually, we're just looking at transportation, but I'm very concerned about the housing, the type of housing that will be built. I know that we're looking at having stacked housing that has, so what kind of stacked housing would it be? Well, it could be condominiums or it could be apartments. That would be basically the 2 types. Is there another type? I think those are the 2 types.
Are you talking about sort of
around these transportation corridors?
I'd hate to be too specific. I mean, there are going to be areas where they do kind of attached row houses. I mean, there could be a lot of different product types. I'd hate to, in the 110 PDAs, I wouldn't want to be too sort of.
Yeah, on the one hand, they were saying that they wanted smaller units, and on the other hand, they were talking about how multi-generational housing seems to be getting much more common and much more desirable. So I can't think that you can have both, unless you have, around this corridor, unless you plan that you can have both, where you would have smaller units and larger multi-generational houses sort of designed in the same area, which seems kind of actually more desirable. Maybe a condominium apartment buildings and then larger housing. So it'll be interesting to see how the different areas plan these.
Absolutely.
Lake Merced did a good job on that.
Where's that?
Look at the Lake Merced in,
Oh, in Lake Merced, yeah.
yeah, they have this mixed type of,
Right.
so that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, but nestled in around work and then around transportation, this actually could be quite exciting. I have a concern, if we're going to put, and I've brought it up before, if we're going to, when there's condominium development, I think almost as much as, I think it's 90% or more, end up having reconstruction litigation, which is very expensive for the homeowners. If we build low-cost housing that is going to be of a condominium type, where there's not an ability to build equity, its association needs to actually increase dues and have special assessments to actually sue the developers, pay the lawyers, actually, to get money to rebuild. And then the maintenance itself, they're going to have money to do that. And that's done through association dues. And if there is no, and people are on fixed income who are getting into these condominiums, and I just see this as a disaster. I live in a condominium, and I can't imagine how it's going to work. I think for Brisbane, if we are going to be considering low and moderate housing, and it's going to be built in a situation where obviously the builder's going to try to maximize their ability to make money on the project, as well they should. Then they might not be actually building with materials that are going to be, wonderful. They're going to be trying to get whatever they can get and put it together. So I don't know that this is the place to talk about it, but it is an overriding concern with me when we're talking about this present plan for building low and moderate housing where there is no ability to have equity. And I just don't know how that's going to work. I just can't imagine how it will work.
That's a really good point. I think markets are always different, and maybe the world will be different in the future. But I think historically, at least in the last 20 years, in most places, including the Bay Area, you find it. I'm not familiar with a project that is built as a standalone low mod for sale project. What you normally find is that on a sale project, you're kind of forcing people to include some number of below market rate low and mod units within a market rate project. I mean, that would be my experience. You don't see, even on a rental basis, for people to build projects that are solely or all low or very low income. But
Right.
you're right. Who knows what the incentives, or there may be different kind of marketing incentives and financing incentives that would create that situation. And you're very, your point's well taken, and I think we kind of keep that in mind as our future rolls out. But right now we're in a position where it's hard to make people do the minimum they're required to do for inclusion area, the bare bone number of low and mod you require. So that's kind of the world.
We certainly should be planning to have low and moderate housing. I mean, we have to have it. We cannot not have it. How are we going to be able to? I can see people, with the best of intentions, really getting in there and buying something and then turning around and having to foreclose on it because, they do not have any chance at all of meeting the expense of maintaining something that wasn't built correctly in the first place. And I think we as a city, I hope we as a city will understand this and see if there's any way we can accommodate it. I don't know how it can be done, but I would hate to see this happen again. The Ridge is a perfect example of an area that, 13 years into the building, basically we had to really rebuild. And a lot of the property people simply have had to foreclose. It's been a tragedy. Well, it's happening all over the place anyway because of the economy. But I don't know what can be done, and I don't know what the planning department can do about it. I don't know what the city council can do about it. I really would like to address the issue.
I think we're I think you've done a good job of sort of articulating the concern, and if and when our residential market picks up and we have projects that kind of fall into the category of what the concerns you've raised, I think that's really, there's an opportunity through the approval process to ensure those kind of issues are resolved. In terms of sort of structuring kind of regulation preemptively, I think that's a much more challenging kind of sort of situation. I think it's kind of the situation we're probably better off dealing with the project, because every project's going to have its own unique sort of financing issues, and so to try to put a one-size-fits-all that may not fit any of the models that come in, I think that's somewhat problematic. But I think you raised some good concerns, and when the market picks up and we're back to dealing with projects that fit that, fall into that category, I think those are all very legitimate concerns to be raised through that approval process.
And I think, once the Ridge is finished being rebuilt, which is going to happen momentarily, I don't know about Landmark, but it's going to be delightful again. But, people are going to want to live there, and it's just going to be really lovely. But if we are designing with the intent of meeting this kind of criteria, then I think my desire would be to see a enchanting kind of lovely space. I don't want to see some potential slum, and that's one reason I was, want a more desirable area than Bayshore. I want people to have, when they move into Brisbane, have a Brisbane experience, an experience of a charming environment, a place where they can say, I'm from Brisbane. I really like Brisbane. I really enjoy this area. And to the best of my ability, and I certainly hope I know the Planning Commission and the City Council feel the same way, we are trying to protect that and promote it. And so, I'll just get off my soapbox at this point, but it's very important, I think, that we take that into consideration as we try to meet these requirements for this particular EIR, the transit EIR. Well, thank you. Sorry, I just spoke. But do we have any recommendations for the City Council? Okay.
No, I think the recommendation the Commission made earlier in the very beginning, I think it's already accommodated, and there was in the letter where they originally included the Baylands as part of the PDA and assigned the number of housing units. So that's been taken care of, and I don't think we have much stake in this particular plan. So
Yeah, I'll
at this
relay,
point.
to the council the robust discussion you had, and I think, but given that I'm really, in a way, I'm much happier that we had the position, we're in the position of, we dealt with kind of the number issue sort of proactively and preemptively, so the numbers we have now are something that you've seen, the council's seen, and everyone's pretty well bought off on, so, I think our work in the past has paid off here, so I don't see the need we're going to be writing anything terribly.
The only comments we can make is regarding some of the things I brought up regarding less than 1% for the,
Yeah.
but I don't know whether they're open to comments at this point or it's already done with or what. This is a draft.
I think those kind of things are certainly, if you want to encourage that a higher sort of proportion be, it was the climate change initiative, right?
Yeah, it's less than 1%.
Yeah. If you want to make that as a policy suggestion, I think that's perfectly fine, and the council can relay that.
Because the climate change also includes the funds that can be set aside for air pollution and all of that too, because that's also all part of the, and also the rising sea issues that the chairperson brought up. So that's, so if you want to make those kind of suggestions, that may not be a bad idea.
Sure.
So that the distribution of the money should take into account the fact that we do have concerns about the climate change, and that portion should be given a little bit more allocation.
Sure. If that's, I don't need a vote on it, but if that's kind of a concern.
And the other thing that I think I didn't quite address is they brought the key investments in San Mateo County, and they mentioned Redwood City Ferry, but they didn't mention anything about South San Francisco Ferry. This is currently on an experimental basis, and if I had to do the project, I will give them a higher priority because it's already there. And I think there was currently it's run by the Genentech people. I think they are the one that is sponsoring some of it. So for me, Redwood City, instead of Redwood City, I think I will put South San Francisco ferry system as probably one of the 5 rather than Redwood City. Redwood City just recently has some of the housing, but South San Francisco has a lot of biotech business already, and also the marina in Brisbane. So that should be suggested also.
I'll double check. I think I'm assuming that these are talking about new improvements as opposed to the existing ferry, which probably falls in the category then of supporting
But the Caltrans
existing
electrification
transit.
is not new. I mean, it's an old project.
Old project, but it physically has not occurred. I mean, I think these are all things that are physically have not occurred on the ground yet, as opposed to South City's ferry. But I'm glad to look into that. I think
That's an
fine.
experimental too. It's not, by the way, it's just, runs only one day, once in the morning and one in the evening, and also sponsored partly by Genentech. So if they wanted to, if they're really concerned about the transportation needs, I think that will be a strong point here, because a lot of people do commute from Oakland, and this takes you right to Jack London. And in the regional plan, they can also talk about the Jack London hub as to how they can distribute the people to BART stations and all the others.
I just have one more question. Do you know what's going to happen on El Camino Real? Talks about it being a big priority. Are they planning on just having more fleets of buses, or?
Well, they're talking about trying to do a dedicated busway, which is bus rapid transit, where, that busway is not subjected to the kind of the regular traffic signalization. I know they have some challenges, though, because of the multiple jurisdictions, and not everybody, it's hard enough to get maybe 2 or 3 jurisdictions to agree to a design, a roadway design, and a configuration. and I know they've been having some challenges coming up with a consistent treatment throughout. And I guess if they can't come up with a true busway, yeah, it would be a matter of a more beefed up bus system. But I think their preference is to try to come up with something that's a true fixed busway. But I think they're a little bit away from having a design that everybody's agreed to. There are a number of jurisdictions who have a finger in that particular issue. And
Yeah, I'm surprised they're not looking into the light rail system along El Camino Real, because a lot of cities, Sacramento and San Diego, they do have the light rail system. Actually, San Francisco also, that goes right in the middle of the Market Street.
Oh, absolutely. I think if the length of El Camino or a significant length were in a single jurisdiction, it would be a very different dialogue that's occurring. But the fact that it crosses so many jurisdictions, it really is a challenge.
And the other opportunity they had, and I don't know why it was not done, when Southern Pacific Railroad abandoned that right-of-way that used to be right next to the El Camino Real.
Yeah.
And now it's just like a bikeway, or it was converted into some kind of parks or something. That corridor was already there. The tracks were already there. And I don't know why they didn't think about putting a transit system on that particular right-of-way.
Yeah, in hindsight, that would have been a very good idea.
And it's not too long ago that the Southern Pacific abandoned that. Once Union Pacific bought that, then they decided they want to abandon that. And it's sitting there. A lot of debris and garbage and everything else there. But so
Didn't realize that. Are we ready to move on, or do we want a break?
yeah, thank you.
Would you like to?
I'm ready. Go ahead. So
Right.
Okay, so items initiated by the commission is a presentation of highlights from the Planning Commissioners Academy by Commissioner Dell.
So it was a 3-day conference provided by the League of California Cities, and it started on the 27th of February and concluded on the 1st of March. So as you can see here, I broke it down into 3 days and listed all of the categories of the workshops. So I'm going to highlight a few. So on Wednesday, we had 4 workshops. The first one was the Ethics and the Public's Trust in Your Planning Decision, AB 1234 training, which is a state ethics educational requirements for all local officials, and that requires 2 hours every 2 years, and it teaches public service ethics laws and principles that's applicable to our role as planning commissioners. So that was a 2-hour class, and it was very nice. It's reinforcing and very invigorating and inspiring, and reminds you why you're doing what you're doing. And the fourth, I thought, of all the 4, aside from the ethics training, the thing that seemed most relevant to our current situation for our city was the Serving Your City workshop. And one of the things that they discussed was how to facilitate change in our city. And given the current conditions of what's going on with the Baylands and with the CEQA and the draft EIR that's coming up, and then now this new draft EIR that we just discussed, it seemed like it was very apt and very timely. And I just wanted to read a little bit of what their suggestions are, and I think that you'll find that it echoes what we're doing now, reflects what we're doing now, and that's really nice to have that reinforcement. So they were saying that change represents new beginnings, which are exciting. Life is about change or become stagnant. Visualizing the positive effects of change helps us embrace it. And when they were saying that, I was thinking about the housing element discussions that we had, where we're talking about mixed housing and how to integrate that and have that transform our city and also be incorporated seamlessly into the current situation that we have. They suggested 5 things. Participate in and encourage comprehensive planning efforts, such as downtown-specific plans and code changes. And we had discussed that in the planning sessions that we're going to have implemented, and provide opportunities for our community to come forth and participate. 2 was to get involved early, to form subcommittees and task force, which we currently are with Karen and and David on this subcommittees that we do have. 3, to speak to those who will be impacted, which is, again, inviting the community to come forward and participate in these conversations. 4, don't be afraid to change the status quo. And I think we go back and forth a lot on the current conditions, what could be, what would be, what should be. And so we are involved in that as well. And 5, remain flexible to learn new concepts and ideas as your city changes and the needs of the residents change. And I think we're always responsive and we're always encouraging of the residents, which is what we need to be doing. So we're on the right track. Thursday, we had 5 workshops presented. I think the 2 most relevant being conceptually the Ubuntu concept of teamwork and collaboration, and how we just had this new change with our, repositioning of our roles, and how the concept of inspiring change and inspiring collaboration is the idea that I am because we are. So, we're commissioners because there is a city for which we need to serve. So I just thought that was a really nice ring to it, and it was very moving. And it comes from the African concept of working together. So the other 2 workshops that I'm going to combine into 2, one is the idea of the CEQA and basics, and it was presenting, things that we already had training on, and the discussion with our city attorney about our role as commissioners in the process of the EIR as it moves forward. So there was a whole portion where I think we had that discussion about how we can receive public comment but still incorporate changes thereafter. And I was reassured by this training that we can have changes implemented. So they were asking about, there were other commissioners that were asking the same questions, like, when should we make the changes and what about making changes? So they were saying that changes are allowed after the document is circulated, after the public comments have been received, and we can provide suggested mitigation factors, right, and to give feedback and add new measures that are not required to mitigate an unavoidable effect and does not create one. So there are opportunities. So that, again, came back around full circle to the discussions and the trainings that we've had here in terms of our positioning and our role as we move forward with that. And it kind of put there's at this point where we are involved, and that would include things such as reviewing the environmental docs, conducting public meetings to accept public input, asking questions or requesting more information, making decisions based on the information in the record, and applying the Commission's independent judgment and analysis. The changes are allowed after the draft EIR is circulated. So that's just a kind of a quick synopsis in a nutshell of where we are currently in our own draft EIR. So on Friday, the last day of the meeting was a half day, and we had 2 sessions, and they were kind of in conflict, so you had to choose one or the other. And I chose the legal and legislative updates section.
Oh, that's good.
Oh, why?
and so there were at least 10 or so, but I picked 3 that I feel that we probably would like to focus on. And the first would be SB 391. And SB 391 is, let's see, I have it here. So 49, 391 is the Senate bill that concerns the California Homes and Jobs Act of 2013. And in a nutshell, this bill is talking about enacting the California Homes and Jobs Act of 2013, which would make legislative findings and declarations relating to the need for establishing permanent ongoing sources of funding dedicated to affordable housing development, which is, again, what the chairwoman was earlier referring to as one of our main thrusts of this year in our current agenda item. The bill would impose a fee except as provided of $75 to be paid at the time of recording of every real estate instrument, paper, or notice required or permitted by law to be recorded. By imposing new duties on counties with respect to the imposition of the recording fee, the bill would create a state mandate local program. So they just gave us a synopsis of status of it right now, which is that it's a bill and they're moving forward, and there's going to be certain lobbyists lobbying for certain interests. But at this point, the league has a certain position, and they will send out position papers requesting, I guess, input. So at that point, hopefully, I don't know, when we get that information, we can, I guess, provide some feedback if it's requested. So that is SB 391. Then AB 745 is the Assembly bill, which concerns the housing element. And the planning is introduced as by Assembly Member Levin. The planning and zoning law requires the city or county to adopt a comprehensive long-term general plan that includes various mandatory elements, including a housing element that in turn is required to contain, among other things, an inventory of resources and constraints relevant to meeting the city's or county's housing needs. So it wasn't very clear as to how this is currently, has it impacted or is it being incorporated in the current housing element discussion? So that wasn't clear.
How is that different from what we have now?
That's, yeah. It was not clear as to how that is different, but there's going to be certain amendments to the housing element discussion, the larger one. So I guess I'm kind of waiting to hear back as to how the amendment actually would impact us, and I'm not sure if that would be a staff initiated discussion or not, or how we as commissioners are expected or allowed or permitted or encouraged to follow up on these things. I'm not sure.
Normally what happens is every year there are a number of bills that start out, and some of them make it into law and some don't. So we normally don't get too involved in tracking until they're actually approved, and then, to the extent that approved bills change requirements of, whether it be our zoning regulations or general plan regulations, we tend to bring that up as part of the next relevant case or action the Planning Commission is taking on that topic. So we normally don't, again, with resources, track a lot of these bills until they're much further along. We get through the league and through the Planning Association and through there's another organization called Association of Environmental Professionals. They all track these kind of things in Sacramento, so we can kind of keep up on that regard, but we don't typically get very involved unless there's some legislation that really has some what we consider a detrimental impact on the city, and then through the city manager and the mayor, we will coordinate comments on the actual legislation. But that's very, very rare, where something they're proposing is that sort of detrimental to our interest.
So I suppose that this was more of like an educational opportunity and just raising awareness that these things are in discussion. And that would follow with the new CEQA guidelines section 15183.3. Now this has actually become, am I right? That has become an amendment.
Sorry, what was the question?
The new CEQA guidelines section 15183.3, the streamlining for infill projects, has been implemented, I believe. And so they were talking about certain, the purpose of it was to streamline the environmental review process for eligible infill projects by limiting the topics subject to review at the project level where the effects of infill development have been addressed in a planning level decision or by uniformly applicable development policies. So I guess that would mean that would apply locally in different ways for various areas. So I wasn't sure how that actually impacts us, because it is something that is currently an amendment that's been passed, but I'm not sure how it has been incorporated in our discussion thus far. So that was something I was going to come back and ask the staff as well.
Really, the issue is whether or not any project that might come forward in Brisbane would fit within the category of this sort of whatever they call it, streamlined activity. So, what we would do is when an application comes in, at a staff level, we have to make some sort of CEQA determination, whether it's exempt or whether we need to do a negative declaration or an EIR. It becomes yet another one of the the things we'll evaluate the project against, these criteria that were set forth and see if it's eligible for this streamlined process or not. The versions I had seen, the way the streamlining exemption was set forth, it didn't seem like it was going to be very applicable to anything that would be forthcoming in town in terms of an application. So I didn't think it was going to have a lot of direct bearing. That's still my reaction, but we'll always go through that process when an application comes in to see if it fits or doesn't fit those criteria.
And that concludes my report.
Good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very good job.
Thank you. Thank you for sending me.
Well, you didn't mention anything about the parties that you have.
There actually wasn't a party. There was just one of a small reception at the end. I think it was on Wednesday night or Thursday night, where there were hors d'oeuvres, and that was pretty much it.
No, I enjoyed those social events because that's where you meet a lot of planning commissioners, and it gives you an opportunity to find out what the other cities are doing. So I hope you had that chance.
It was really nice, yeah.
Did you have, we met, when I went, there were like breakfasts and lunches where we met and other commissioners and found out about their particular areas. And did you have that experience?
We had one round table, I believe, that involved the application of CEQA, which was on Thursday. And so we had a round table there, and I think that was the breakfast.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And then we had discussions about is CEQA applicable for certain areas, meaning are they having those kind of projects. But other than that, no. Yeah. I think they kind of skimmed down this year, maybe.
Probably.
Because there's only one.
I remember in when I went, the ethics, component there was where there was the most interaction of the commissioners from the various cities, because you're in there for several hours together, and that's where I spoke to most of the other commissioners and saw that, wow, you're part of this larger community. So that was...
Well, this year they presented in sort of like a lecture format, so the commissioners didn't really get to discuss the ethics. It was more like we were actually being trained on the ethics. And so
'cause we had more, that's it. They must,
so it was a different format this year, at least for that. Yeah, I didn't realize that they had I would have loved the other format.
yeah.
I feel like that application would have been much more handy for me to actually use it as opposed to just listening to it.
Yeah.
Okay. You pick up some.
But you did manage to talk with quite a number of the commissioners from
So, yeah.
areas.
Yeah, we were all in the same hotel, so a lot of times, and there was a Starbucks right outside, so we would sit out there and discuss a lot of stuff. And I actually became quite acquainted with one of the San Mateo commissioners. I don't know if I should mention him, Rick. So Rick Manina, he was very nice, and it was very nice to see some local, and it was very difficult to find because they actually didn't list the people by area, which would have allowed us to
Well, that
have more common ground to discuss.
I think they changed the format, because
Yeah,
I
so-
remember seeing where they were from, and that's...
Yeah, and then we would talk
Fremont.
about things that were local.
Yeah, we would see people, but it would be on a name tag. It wouldn't be a list, because if you had a list, you can kind of seek them out. But here it's kind of punting, right? So it's touch and go. Oh, I happen to see him. I just happen to sit at the same table, during the breakfast morning. So I guess the format.
Yeah, it seems like it's
Changed
changed
a
a
little
bit.
bit.
Yeah, it changed
Yeah.
a little bit.
Hope you picked up some good books.
I did.
Oh, yeah.
I got a couple of good
Selling
books.
books.
Very inspirational.
Good.
Are there any subcommittee updates at this point?
No, I'm still waiting for the next scheduled sustainability and green building meeting dates. So,
Was there anything else from the staff? Well, I guess at this point, we're ready to adjourn.
No, I have a
Nope.
couple of
Oh,
things
sorry,
here.
so,
One is we requested the letter last meeting, and I have not seen it in this package here, so are we still expecting that?
Get it next week.
Okay. You know
From the
what
last
letter
meeting?
you're talking about,
yeah,
right?
we
You
wrote a
have-
letter.
The letter that we were going to send regarding the
Housing sites.
BWR
mm-hmm.
project, we
Right.
were requesting that so that letter we expect next week? Okay.
In our next meeting.
Okay.
Actually, we'll probably just distribute it electronically as opposed
Okay.
to, I don't think we need to have a,
Yeah, but
I wasn't planning on agendizing it. It was just-
we were all going to sign it, though.
Yeah.
So,
We can do that electronically
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
in the course. Or if we want,
Come
we,
down.
if it ends up
just have it
drafting and it's ready by the next meeting and that happens to be the
Yeah,
time.
whatever.
Whatever works, okay.
but
Yeah.
I just don't want to forget that, so that we,
And come down and sign it.
We could
Leave
come
it
down
in the
and sign
office.
it. It's not that far
Yeah.
away.
okay, the other suggestion I have is just a minor suggestion here, and this is to do with the internet and other access. Maybe you can add this year, meetings are broadcast live on Comcast Channel 27, and by streaming video via link, whatever. Rebroadcast are during the week after the meeting. See the link on city homepage for the Comcast reschedule. That schedule is already there, so I think it will be appropriate to just give the time and days when it happens. And I think it's Tuesday or Wednesday and Friday, those 2 days. So you don't have to, people don't have to bother to go and look at the schedule and website and all that. Just mention that here, the rebroadcast will be on such and such dates.
Yes, I can add that.
Yeah, so that way, people don't have to fiddle around and...
You could add subject to change, just in case the dates
Well,
don't always stick.
they have not changed in a number of years that I've...
Sure, but
If
I
they
mean,
change, then we can change it here, but
Really?
I thought...
Never knew it was so stable.
So I just thought that it will make it easy for the citizens to see that, okay, I can watch it on Tuesdays, so...
Sure.
That's what my
point.
take on this was. And other than that, I don't have any other item. I try not to talk too much today, so hopefully you guys appreciate that. So
I thought all the input we could give was important.
yeah,
Also, I forgot to thank our Development Department Director, John Sweeky, for such a comprehensive education on this. I thought it was very good.
thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very helpful. All right, so any more information? Okay, so now we're going to adjourn to the regular meeting of May 9th, 2013.
Great.
make a motion to adjourn until the regular meeting of May 9th, 2013.
Great. Okay, I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Well, thank you very much.